This year for Advent, we will be celebrating the season with a sermon series titled Family Tree. We will be following the liturgical calendar for its themes such as joy, love, hope, and peace, while looking at the genealogy of Jesus. We will take a closer look at the ancestors of the Christ and how their stories embodied the spirit of the Advent season long before there was a manger and a star. To help further this celebration, we would love to decorate the stage and lobby with a lot, and I mean a lot, of trees. We have plans for stage design, the church lobby, and the Zootown kids lobby, and every tree helps. Would you consider donating your artificial trees to Zootown this season so we can make the holiday feel extra special? All trees will be returned to their owners in January in the condition in which they are received, we promise. Thanks for being a part of something more.
Just something that we're planning here. Right there in the video, we want to put trees like all over the stage and all throughout the building, and we have some already. That's awesome. And my wife immediately took up the call and went to the thrift store and found like 6 more. So we're already amassing trees. But if you have, maybe you have like old artificial trees you don't use anymore. Maybe you're not going to put up a tree because you're going to Arizona where it's warm for Christmas. I don't know. Maybe you're like, hey, it's not a big deal. We can get a real tree this year, and we'll just let the church borrow our tree. Chad promises that you will get your tree back, and it will be intact. So if not, you can talk to Chad. But we're just going to be collecting those over the next month. We're going to be decorating for Advent here at the end of the month. And so, so if you think that's possible, you think you could do that, if you've got an old tree in your garage, bring it on in, and we will make use of it. And we appreciate that. I'm excited for Advent and for that season. Also, I know earlier, like a few weeks ago, I told you, like, hey, we're gonna have different voices up here, and it's gonna be, we're gonna spread it around and have kind of a teaching team. And then I've been up here like 4 out of the last 5 weeks, and so I promise you, we are still doing that. Okay, so if you're like, I know Ty spoke a few weeks ago, but part of our vision for this season, as we're, we don't have a lead pastor at the moment, but part of our vision for this season is to develop a teaching team, and so we've started doing that. We've got some people who are meeting weekly and bi-weekly to kind of like look forward and say, pray and say, what does our church need? What does God want to speak to our church? And then together we're kind of creating the vision for what that looks like and who's going to be speaking and what they're going to be speaking on. And so we just want to remind you that it's just a cool opportunity to have multiple voices and to really hear God speak through many different people. And so I know lately it's mostly been me, but it won't be that way always, okay? So wanted to let you know about that, and also just celebrate that we're, God is in each of us. Like, each one of you hears his voice. And so the idea that just one person should be the only person telling you, about him or trying to communicate his heart for our church is kind of silly. And so we really want to celebrate that. We really want to lead you, and hopefully then it also kind of reflects in you that you trust, like, I see that God can speak through more people than just one, and I know then that also he speaks to me and that he can use me too. And so I want to encourage you with that. But today we're starting a brand new series today. It's called Heart. And I kind of want to take a few minutes just to kind of lay the groundwork for the series. And then we'll kind of run through week 1 and what's on my heart for this series. So really, we called it Heart because primarily in the scriptures, the word heart doesn't refer to our physical heart. It's not referring to the giant muscle in our chest that's pumping blood all throughout our bodies and keeping us alive. Instead, it's sort of referring to like the center of one's being. And we see this in verses like Proverbs 4:23, which says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, You could also probably say that about the physical heart, right? But like, guard the heart, because if something happens to that heart, you're not going to be doing much. But we also see here kind of like a deeper reality that there's it's talking about sort of this metaphysical heart. And within that, like, we understand that exists, right? Because we have terms even in English that refer to like being heart sick or heartbroken, having a joyful heart. It's not really talking about like, your chest muscle. It's talking about something deeper that if you've ever experienced pain of loss, or if you experienced kind of like deep disappointment, you might have even felt it like right here. You know that feeling? And it's like, I think that's why the ancients referred to that part of us as the heart, because I think they were like, man, there's this something in my chest that when I feel loss, when I feel pain, when I feel joy, it's like it's right here. And so maybe that's my heart. And it's kind of mysterious. You can't see it. It isn't physical, but it's still very real, to the point where, this proverb even says, like, everything you do flows from this reality of your heart. It's something that isn't just a physical thing within each one of us. As a group, you can actually have like a collective heart as well. And we see this when God speaks to the people of Israel through the prophet Ezekiel. He says, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you. He says, I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And we can kind of see a few things here. One is that, as individuals, as people, and as a people group together, that it's important that we need to guard our heart. We need to guard what goes into our inner self, our inner life. Because like all of our decisions and our direction, it all flows from the health of that internal world. But also, the condition of our heart can become hard. And you've heard the term hard-hearted, right? Like we're coming up on Advent. It's kind of that Ebenezer Scrooge sort of mentality, like, just no compassion at all. So we can become hard-hearted. And here, God is actually promising, he says to the people of Israel, I'm going to remove that heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. In other words, I'm going to remove that heart of stone. I'm going to do some heart surgery on you. And I'm going to replace it with a heart that's tender toward me, that's sensitive to his love, sensitive to his correction, sensitive to his guidance. I have a friend who walked through the door one day and was like yellow, like bordering on orange. And I'm not talking like fake tan orange. I'm talking like that sickly color of skin. And I was like, something's wrong with you. Like and they're like, yeah, I'm going to the doctor later today. So they went to the doctor, and all the tests and everything, they found out that they had gallstones. But it wasn't just like a couple little gallstones, which I'm sure would be problematic and painful, but it actually had all of these little stones had sort of combined into one large gallstone. Yeah, I'm sorry if this is gross. It might gross some of you out. But here's what happened, okay? It was the size of a plum, all of these gallstones. And so the gallbladder around it was just like kind of mush, and they were like, it's got to come out. We have to remove it. And this is how I think it kind of goes sometimes with us, like with our hearts, right? That like sometimes it's like all these little things, but they sort of gather together, they sort of compact together until all of a sudden God's looking at it and he's like, okay, there, right there in the core of who you are, there is this, hard conglomeration that I need to remove. I have to do surgery. I have to take it out. But my friend, he couldn't get a new gallbladder. They just removed it. I guess you don't need those. He's fine. But with our heart, God says, I'm not just going to remove this hard heart. I'm not just going to take that away, but I'm actually going to give you a new one. I'm going to give you one that's soft, one that's sensitive, one that's ready to be led by me. So this series called Heart, it's a journey toward sort of removing things, like removing and simplifying our faith, grounding it in the things that matter most. We're going to spend the next 4 weeks, but honestly, I think this is a series that we may even come back to from time to time, right? Because there's just so much that we could dig into. 4 weeks isn't nearly enough, but we're going to spend the next 4 weeks and come back to it from time to time. But the series is really, it's an effort to sort of focus us as a church and as people on the essentials of following Jesus. We're going to explore, different facets of the Christ-centered heart, and also practices that keep us, that help us to cultivate that heart within ourselves. We want to know his love and his compassion, his forgiveness and his purpose, and we want to reflect those things to the world. And we have to recognize that as we sort of go through this life, we tend to just pick up things in our innermost beings, things that just get lodged in there. And over time, those can kind of distract from the main things. So as a church, we want to sort of declutter. We want to just remove anything that sort of gets attached to Jesus, because when people come in here, when they join us at church, and people who are seeking God, we don't want them to have a hard time seeing him. And sometimes when things get stuck to the message, when things that aren't the core, that aren't the heart of the message, get stuck to it, it becomes hard to see who Jesus really is. But we don't want to obscure or distract from Jesus in any way. C.S. Lewis said this. He said, the perfect church service would be one where we are almost unaware of. Our attention would have been on God. The perfect church service would have been one we are almost unaware of. Our attention would have been on God. And I think that's the challenge, right? That we want to present Jesus. We want to, we want people to see and experience Christ. But too often, our own little things kind of can get in the way and kind of obscure that picture, kind of clutter the view. I was thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about how, did anybody ever get into stickers? Like, when you were a kid, you put them on your water bottle, you put them on your, my guitar case, that's where I put mine. But I can remember sometimes that people would put them on mirrors, And like over time, when those stickers like on the mirror, it's like all of a sudden it gets hard to see what you want to actually see, because like those stickers are kind of obscuring the view. And sometimes we've put stickers onto Jesus that don't belong there, and it kind of like it obscures the view. It makes it hard for people to see who he really is. So I'm definitely painting with a broad brush. And I don't want to make this about like calling out where Christianity has sort of like has done that. I want to make it more about us just looking at ourselves and saying like, Lord, where does our heart need to refocus? Where does our heart as a church, as individuals, need to refocus and need to come back to the heart of the gospel? So today, week 1, we're going to talk a little bit just about the heart of God. And I know that's like, wow, man, swing for the fences. That's a huge topic. The heart of God, the whole heart of God. There's like entire libraries probably written about this subject, and now I have 25 minutes to try to break it down in some way. And I'm not going to try to give you the definitive word on the heart of God today, okay? But I just want to give us kind of an angle for us to ponder, and something for us to think about and to chew on, because we're aiming for the heart, right? We're aiming for the center, the most core, the most essential.
there might not be a better verse that sums up God's heart than one that we all know, because if you've ever watched a sporting event, if you've ever watched a baseball game or anything, you've seen it on a sign and somebody's in the outfield like holding it up. It's John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And if we really want to know what God's heart is, I think there's no better place to look than to look at Jesus, because that is God's heart revealed. And if we were to sort of, we want to strip away the extra, we want to remove anything that clutters it, then we need to hone in on who Christ is and what it means that God would send him, that he would give him to us. Even the Apostle Paul had this epiphany. So Paul, he was an evangelist, he was a missionary, he traveled around, and one of the places that he went was Athens. And Athens at the time was kind of a center of debate and knowledge. Like people would they had this place where they would go, it was called Mars Hill, and they would go and they would sit and they would just talk philosophy and talk ideas, and they would try to just, convince each other of different things. And so Paul goes to this place, he goes to Athens, he goes to Mars Hill, and he delivers this incredible sermon, like full of great rhetoric. Like he uses cultural examples, he even quotes some of their poets, to like show them who Jesus was. And it's just it's a brilliant rhetorical exercise. But what ends up happening is he gets done with it, and these guys are all like, well, that sounds pretty cool. We'd like to hear more about it. Maybe you could come back next week for debate club, And Paul is like, he's just irritated. Now, there were a few people that converted. There's a few people that were like, hey, actually, we believe you, Paul, so we're going with you. But Paul kind of gets irritated. He doesn't go back for debate club. He actually leaves town, and we're told that he goes to Corinth. Now, when you read the first letter that Paul wrote to Corinth, he kind of references this moment. And he says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, he says, when I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the testimony of God to you with superior speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God. So this is really like a significant moment in Paul's life, because he's kind of like, I was just in Athens and I dropped knowledge on those fools, right? Like I gave the best sermon ever, and I realized it didn't really work that much. So you know what I'm gonna do? The same thing I did among you. I focused on Christ and him crucified. I didn't do it with persuasive words. See, we like people that are real persuasive. We like people that are good talkers. We want to hear somebody who's like, man, like when they talk, just convinces me. It's just so good. But Paul's like, I was weak. I was in fear and trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not that persuasive. But I focused on Jesus and I focused on the power of God. So it kind of begs the question, like, what is the power of God? It's like, if that's what Paul decided was more important than great rhetorical argument. And what he actually says is that it actually is like the chapter right before that, in chapter 1, he tells us what the power of God is. He says, for the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The message of the cross is the power of God. So the power of God is rooted in this idea of who Jesus is, that he came, that he died on the cross. That really, that's where the true power is contained. And I think what the message of the cross really reveals to us as people is how far God will actually go to be with us. And I want to spend the rest of the time kind of focusing on this idea, because I think this is the heart of God. And I think it was always God's heart to be with his people. You see this in the very beginning, right? The Garden of Eden, the first two people, Adam and Eve. And you see what happens there is that God would actually come down and he would walk with them. It says in the cool of the day that they would walk in the garden together. That God created this garden. He created this beautiful place. He created man and woman, but he didn't just like walk away from it and be like, well, let's just put it in motion and see how they do. I hope they have a good time. Figure it out. And someday they'll be driving electric cars. You know, like his goal was not to just kind of like wind it up and watch it go. He actually wanted to be a part of it. And so he would come down and he would walk with them. And it's always been his heart to be with his people. You look at the people of Israel. Another great example, right, is that God, when he leads them out of Egypt and he is with them in the desert, there's a pillar of fire by day and a pillar of fire, or a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day, and it's leading them across the wilderness, that they know his presence is with them and that he's leading them and guiding them. But then on top of that, eventually they get to the promised land and they've got a nation going on and they have these judges that are kind of ruling over them, but it's kind of confusing. And they're like, man, everybody else has a king. And God is like, my plan is that I would be your God and you would be my people, that I would be with you and leading you. And yet they're like, but we'd kind of rather elect a dude that would do that job. And God's like, all right, like it's going to be trouble. It's going to be hard. You're not going to like all of the outcomes. But he lets them do it. But his plan all along was to be with them. And so really we see this sort of the supreme example of God with us is Jesus. And we know that, right? Like, gentle plug for Advent again, but you know, Advent season is coming, and there's a name for Jesus that we always talk about, or it's always a part of like Christmas, and it's Emmanuel, God with us, right? Emmanuel. It means literally God with us. And so when Jesus is born, Jesus, who is also God, is literally with us. Now, this is something that the very smart people call the incarnation, that God would become man. John chapter 1, he's kind of in his like big preamble where he's explaining how Jesus has always been, he's always existed, and how he came to be with us. And he says this in John 1:14, he says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We have seen his glory. So he says the Word became flesh, and the Word is a reference to Jesus, and this word became flesh means he tabernacled among us. Now, if you don't know what tabernacle is, that was kind of like the tent that was before the temple that would travel with the people. And essentially what God is saying is like Jesus came down and he set up his tent in our camp. That he bought a house in the neighborhood and moved in. Like, he was so committed to being with his people that he actually put on flesh and became one of us. Paul tries to explain what this meant, and if you think about it, it's pretty staggering to think of God becoming a human. I heard one pastor said one time, like, God becoming human is ridiculous as a man becoming a frog, you know? Like, it's probably more ridiculous than that. But here's what Paul said in Philippians. He said this, though he was God, he being Jesus, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to, but instead he gave up his privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. And when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So what does it mean to us that Jesus became a man? I don't want to overstate it here, but it kind of means everything. What we see in Scripture over and over is that our God could have been distant. Everybody else's gods were. They didn't know how to appease them. Maybe if we make a sacrifice, the rain will come, you know? Our God could have stayed away. He could have remained separate and somewhere else. He could have been far away and only interacted with us via messengers. But instead, over and over and over again, God chooses to come close. And even when we run from him, he comes to find us. And even when we sin, somehow he rescues us and redeems it. Even when we totally screw our lives up, he's still there with hope that it can change. He finds us when we're lost, and he leads us out of it. The heart of God is not just to be near, but his heart is also to lead us as people. John 10:14, Jesus is speaking, and he says this. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and they know me. And just as my Father knows me, and I know my Father, so I sacrifice my life for the sheep. I've shared some of this before, but I had the blessing of growing up in a very, I grew up in church, and I had parents who were very convicted. And I don't mean convicted like they were felons. I mean like they were convicted about things. And some of you, I love it when I get to like hang out with people who were raised in church, because we like swap stories. You know what I mean? It's kind of like people who had difficult lives, but we didn't have difficult lives. We just were raised in church. And it's like, oh man, what TV shows were you not allowed to watch? You know? And it's like, what? You could watch Smurfs? My mom said they were communists. I couldn't watch that. You know? It's like, and there's just like, I wouldn't even call it religious trauma, because it would be like, it would probably be like, there's probably way more serious things that are called religious trauma, but it's just funny, you know? It's like, oh, I wasn't allowed to listen to those bands, but I could listen to Michael W. Smith, you know? It's like, so I always love that. But I do say, like, it was a blessing to grow up in a house with parents who were very convicted. And I mean that because, you know, one of the things that one of our goals at Zootown Church is to sort of remove the clutter, like we've been talking about. Remove the clutter that keeps people from seeing Jesus and actually experiencing his love. And too often, some of the things that have been like added to Jesus have become barriers that sort of keep people from being able to see who he really is, from being able to actually trust him with their life. And so one of our goals is just to like introduce people to Jesus, but without all of the extras, without the baggage and the things that have been added to it. And, you know, I say that because, like, I grew up with a lot of rules that I had to follow as a Christian. And I'm actually thankful for it, but not necessarily like the unwritten rules or like the big Christian rules. Like, definitely there are some things that, you know, are non-negotiables if you follow Jesus. Like, you can't just say, like, he doesn't care about those things. But what I love the most is that my parents had extra things. And some of those extra things at times were just absolutely crazy from a child's standpoint. Like, my sisters were required to wear skirts, and they had to wear skirts that were past their knees, and they had to do that for like 8 years or something like that. We had a rule one time that like we couldn't speak in the kitchen. I'm like, all of a sudden, we like come to dinner one night, and it's like, nope, we can't talk in the kitchen. Like, this is super weird, right? Like, I don't understand. But the thing about that is all of those rules, all of those extras, all of those things that my parents felt like they were asked to do by God, like that they all lasted for a season, but then it was over. And all of a sudden, my sisters could wear pants, and all of a sudden, we could talk in the kitchen again, you know? But it taught me something, and it taught me something that I think is maybe far more important than many other things that I learned and gleaned from my parents. And that is that as Christians, we're not just called to follow a set of rules or a list of do's and don'ts or jump through a bunch of hoops. Like, we're called to hear the voice of our good shepherd and to follow that voice. And Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and they know me. My sheep hear my voice. And this is like, it's probably the most profound thing that I got. And I didn't get it from seeing the 10 Commandments printed on the wall. I got it from the demonstration of my parents that, you know what, this sounds weird, but we're going to do it because we feel like that's what God's asking us to do. And when we feel like he's not asking us to do it anymore, well, then we won't do it anymore. And that's this really beautiful picture of following Jesus, of just taking that next step with him. Convictions can create problems, but the thing that I've found about Jesus is that when you meet Jesus, undoubtedly you will be convicted about something. And it's impossible not to read scripture and see this everywhere, that people meet Jesus and there's like Zacchaeus is a great example, right? It's like, here he is, going through life. Life's great. He wants to see Jesus. He meets Jesus. Jesus comes to his house. All of a sudden, he's like, man, that's it. I've got to sell all my stuff. I'm going to pay people back. I'm going to do things. Like, he immediately became convicted. There's no record of Jesus preaching to him about what he needed to do. He just became convicted in the presence of Christ. And when we meet Jesus, you know, he's not the kind of Savior that comes to us to just make us feel good about ourselves. Like, hey, like, I'm fuzzy, Jesus, and you can snuggle me when you're scared. Like, that's not how it works. That's not who Jesus is. Jesus comes to us, and immediately we realize, like, oh, okay, there's some things, isn't there, Jesus? And he's kind of like, yeah. It's like, I love you still. Like, I'm here for you. That's why I'm here. But there's some things, and you're like, okay, yeah, I need to make some changes. I'm going to do some things different. That's the presence of Christ, because he's not just here to be with us, but he's here to lead us. You know, when I was a kid, I thought my parents' convictions were really weird. And I just knew deep down, like, we're not like everybody else. Like, we're that weird family that doesn't talk in the kitchen or whatever, you know? But the thing about that is that, like, over time, it taught me that there's nothing, that who I am is different, and that's okay. And when we follow Jesus, like, who we are is going to be different. Like, our lives are not going to look like everyone else's lives. They should be radical. They should be different. We should be willing to be like, you know, it's weird, but I think Jesus wants me to do it. And it taught me that just this simple lesson, that following Jesus is hearing his voice and taking the next step that you feel like he's asking you to take. Jesus didn't actually ever tell anybody to become a Christian. Now, most of you probably are not shocked by that, but there are some people probably who are like, I thought that was the same thing, you know? But in reality, like, what Jesus actually called people to was to follow him. And he didn't even start with, like, make a decision. If you've been in church, you've probably been in a service where somebody's like, you need to make a decision for Jesus. And now's the moment, you know, and you're feeling convicted. You're like, oh, he's looking at me. Like, I'm going to go up there. I think God works through those moments, okay? I'm not knocking that. But I am saying, like, the first thing Jesus told people to do is just to come and see. Like, come and see. And I think when we talk about the heart of God and just sort of coming back to the bare essentials, like, this is where it all starts.